COP27 in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh is a little more than 3 weeks away. And we're seeing companies, officials and investors start to set the expectations for the significance of this year's COP. Simone Foxman is with me from Doha. Simone, look, what is the sense of how big this COP will be and what we might get?
I think there are two things here, Manis. First off, we expect much less fanfare than we saw around COP26 in Glasgow. Secondly, it's going to be a lot harder for delegations there to really make true progress on some of these initiatives because they're turning from promises to implementation. In fact, Bloomberg New Energy Finance gives the likelihood of success, what they call success, just 43%. They evaluated 9 different objectives that delegations will have as they go into this meeting and gave them ratings of 1 out of 10, or of 1 to 10. The highest rating we really saw probability-wise was 6 out of 10, and the goals around 2030 emissions likely to be very challenging. We're also going to see a lot less in the way of global executives, particularly from the finance community, going to the event. We understand that BlackRock's Larry Fink will not be in attendance. Spokespeople for Citi's CEO as well as Standard Chartered's both say they will not go either. So fewer global leaders, however, or fewer business leaders perhaps. However, we will see U.S. President Joe Biden going, so that could surely drive some headlines.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the who's who that's attending that. And then I think what's going to be much more interesting, Simone, who's who attending FII, anybody on the list, anybody not on the list from the Americans. What is it they say? Presidents come and go, oil remains forever. Let's talk about the EU, the executive arm there, putting forward a new package of sanctions. Now, this is on Iran. So what is the significance of this? Because you and I have spent a lot of time talking about the JCPOA, the return to the JCPOA, the optimism about the JCPOA. Does this affect that trajectory?
Well, certainly all of this is having an impact on the likelihood of JCPOA, and we've only gotten more cynical about this as we go on. You know, these sanctions specifically seem to target, we understand from diplomats, 15 Iranian people and entities that the EU considers associated with some of the crackdown on these protests. Individual sanctions against people come to be thought of as a bit more important at this point, just given the massive amounts of U.S. sanctions in particular that are on the country, whereas individual sanctions restrict the movement and behavior of specific people. So those thought to have a little bit more of an effect. But foreign governments have really been struggling to figure out ways to try and support Iranian protesters at this point because they don't necessarily want those protesters to be painted along with the objectives of their governments, the democratic objectives of their governments, but they do want to support them. And so that's why we've seen a lot of interest in supporting availability of internet. Wendy Sherman in the United States, the Deputy Secretary of State, going out and talking in a virtual conference yesterday with lots of tech companies. Generally, however, we're seeing the crackdown intensify. Reports of gunfire in several cities around the country, including Isfahan, as human rights groups warn that more and more people are being killed in the response to these protests.
And just set the table for me. I've mentioned the pushback from Saudi Arabia in terms of the criticism of the cut. His Royal Highness wouldn't talk about politics with me in any depth in the interview. They wouldn't do it in the news conference either. But this is the beginning of the foreign ministry pushing back, not the oil ministry. Interesting nuance.
That is an interesting nuance, Manis, and certainly maybe that's a response to the very political response that we've seen from the likes of the United States, which is coming not just from President Biden, but also from Congress. And really, Saudi Arabia painting this as a noble objectives to try and stabilize the oil market, despite the criticisms and the pushback that they've gotten from the U.S. and other oil consumers. What's interesting to me as well is that they didn't necessarily paint this as a sort of economic priority for Saudi Arabia. Remember, oil break-evens are at around $80 a barrel in terms of the fiscal policy. And there's really a desire to separate this from backing Russia versus stabilizing the oil market. I wonder if they'll maybe begin making that economic argument that we need oil at this sort of price level. And maybe it's a selfish reason, but it's one that's certainly maybe more understandable to people around the world.